Welcome to Sleepy Tales, where relaxing stories are told slowly and softly to help you gently fall asleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. For more peaceful tales, subscribe and hit the bell to stay updated. Now, get comfortable and drift off to tonight's bedtime story. This is the story of the Snow Queen, a being whose heart was colder than the sharpest ice, whose presence could silence the warmest laughter, and whose world was one of endless frost and haunting beauty. In her kingdom, winter stretched without end, and even the brightest sun seemed powerless against the chill. It is a story of frozen mirrors that shatter hearts, of journeys through lands of snow and glass, and of a boy and a girl bound by a thread that not even the fiercest cold could sever. This is a tale of courage and love, not the loud, heroic kind sung in songs, but the quiet, persistent force that can melt the most merciless frost. Step into the Snow Queen's realm, where beauty can be deadly, and warmth is the rarest treasure of all. Long ago, in a time when the world was still young and shadows had sharp edges, there existed a strange and terrible mirror. It was not made by hands guided by light or care, but by a demon whose mind delighted in the cruelty of reflection. This mirror did not show the world as it was, nor did it honor the brightness in the hearts of those who looked upon it. It magnified every flaw, every sorrow, every selfish thought, twisting even the kindest acts into something small and ugly. The laughter of children became a clatter of harsh noise. The gentle touch of a friend was reduced to cold indifference, and the warmth of love was turned to frost. The demon laughed at the mirror's power, for he knew that anyone who gazed into it would begin to see the world through eyes sharpened by cruelty. For a long while, the mirror lay in the demon's hidden place, and no one knew of its existence. Then, as happens with all things made in malice, the mirror broke. The crack started in one corner, a faint line that grew until it split the entire glass into 1,000 jagged pieces. The shards flew outward in a silent storm, carried by wind and shadow, scattering to the far corners of the earth. Some fell into forests, hidden among the roots of trees, where travelers would never suspect their presence. Some landed in the streets of towns, where people's feet would crush them without noticing. And some floated through the air, as if carried by invisible hands, until they lodged themselves in the eyes and hearts of those who wandered too near. The effect was subtle at first. A shard no larger than a grain of sand could twist a single thought, like a hidden thorn pressing against the mind. A small shard in the eye could make someone see a friend's smile as false, a parent's care as weakness, a world of beauty as something unworthy. And in the heart, even the tiniest piece could chill the warmth of love, making a person indifferent to the joys that had once stirred them. The world began to feel slightly colder, a little sharper, though few understood why. In a small town, nestled between gentle hills and a river that moved with lazy patience, there lived a boy named Kai. He was a child of ordinary curiosity, neither particularly brave nor particularly clever, but with a heart that noticed small things: a bird's nest, a song of a distant flute, the kindness of an old neighbor. At first, Kai's world was simple and full of gentle pleasures. He had friends with whom he laughed, parents who watched him with quiet pride, and days that passed without the weight of worry. But one morning, something changed. A shard of the broken mirror, invisible and light as air, found its way into Kai's eye. He did not notice it as it entered, and at first he did not feel its presence. Yet slowly, he began to see the world differently. The sun no longer seemed warm, its light harsh against his skin. The river, once gentle and playful, appeared murky and cold, its movement aimless and cruel. Faces of people he loved looked strange and distant, as if hidden behind glass, their smiles meaningless. Kai's thoughts, once simple and bright, began to twist. Small irritations seemed unbearable, and moments of happiness felt hollow. He did not speak of it, for he did not understand it himself. His parents noticed only that he was quieter than before, less eager to run outside with friends, and more easily frustrated by the smallest inconveniences. His friends, puzzled, began to keep their distance, not knowing why his laughter no longer matched theirs. Kai felt the subtle tug of separation, the invisible thread between himself and the warmth of the world loosening. The shard worked in secret, embedding itself further into his mind. When he looked at the sky, he saw only cold light, not the blue of noon or the soft pink of sunset. Flowers seemed fragile and pointless, and the songs of birds sounded sharp and unnatural. Even memories he had cherished began to feel distant, like pictures in a book someone else had written. He could not explain this change, and he feared that speaking would make it worse. The warmth of his own heart was fading, replaced by a quiet numbness, the first frost of something deeper. As the days passed, Kai's estrangement grew. His parents, worried, tried to reach him with gentle words, but their voices sounded flat and distant to him. Friends invited him to play, but he found little interest in their games, and when he joined, he felt as though he were moving through a fog. He began to withdraw into himself, noticing details that others missed, the way shadows stretched unnaturally, the sound of wind across rooftops, the sharp edges of the world that once had been soft and forgiving. Even the kindness of strangers appeared suspicious. Yet not all of Kai was lost. A small spark remained, hidden beneath the frost forming in his heart. Sometimes, when he glimpsed a bright star at night, or the unexpected kindness of a small creature, the shard would tremble, and the coldness would waver for a brief moment. These moments were fragile, easily covered again by the sharpness in his vision and the distortion of thought, but they hinted at a resilience that had not yet been extinguished. The shard's influence also began to affect his dreams. Night after night, Kai would wander through landscapes of ice and shadow, guided by no one, feeling both fear and fascination. He dreamed of a palace high in the mountains, its walls glinting like glass, its windows reflecting a world that seemed not entirely real. And in these dreams, there was a presence, cold, commanding, and beautiful, a figure that watched him with eyes as hard as ice. He did not yet know her name, nor the full power she held, but the feeling of being drawn to that place lingered even after he awoke. In the ordinary world, life continued with its rhythms, but for Kai, each day brought a greater sense of disconnection. The joy of small victories, the finding of a lost object, the laughter of a friend, the comfort of a familiar path, was muted. His heart, touched by the shard, began to follow a path away from the warmth of home, guided by a force he could not see or name. The mirror's shattering had sent many shards across the earth, but this one had found him, and it had begun its work. And so, Kai stood at the edge of a new experience, one that would carry him far from the small town he had always known. The frost in his heart was not yet complete, but it was gathering strength, whispering promises of distant lands and challenges that could chill the soul. Little did he know that the world was larger than the hills and rivers of his home, that a journey awaited him across forests, fields, and frozen rivers, and that the Snow Queen, the figure from his dreams, was already reaching out to him through the cold that had begun to touch his heart. Kai's change was quiet, subtle, almost invisible to others, yet unstoppable. The warmth of home and friendship was still near, like the faint glow of embers beneath snow, but the path before him led toward the frost, toward the unknown palace, and towards the Snow Queen, whose beauty and power could freeze even the strongest hearts. The first threads of his estrangement had been woven, delicate yet unyielding, preparing the stage for a journey that would test courage, love, and the fragile persistence of the human spirit. In the small town, life went on, unaware of the frost creeping into Kai's heart, unaware of the shards scattered across the world, and unaware of the cold figure waiting in the distance, whose eyes could pierce through ice and glass alike. And so, the first chapter of a tale of winter, hearts, and mirrors came to its quiet pause, leaving Kai on the edge of the world he had always known, drawn toward a kingdom that promised beauty, danger, and a test of warmth against the coldest of forces. Far to the north, beyond mountains that scraped the sky, and forests where even the sun struggled to warm the ground, there lay a kingdom that no ordinary traveler would find. The Snow Queen's realm was a land of endless winter, where the wind carried a sharpness that could pierce skin and thought alike, and where ice stretched over valleys and rivers like glass. Frozen in perpetual stillness, trees grew in stark silhouettes, their branches heavy with frost, bending under the weight of countless winters. Rivers that had once whispered and tumbled were now silent, hard as stone, reflecting the pale, cold sky. Snow fell without end, settling on the earth in layers so deep that the world seemed muffled, as though every sound was swallowed by the whiteness. Within this frozen kingdom stood palaces that rose like jagged mountains, their spires sharp and glistening, catching light from the sun and moon alike, though the warmth of either rarely touched the land. Windows were mirrors of ice, perfectly smooth and unyielding, reflecting images with a clarity that was almost cruel in its precision. Every hall, every staircase, every chamber was sculpted from frost and crystal, the architecture at once magnificent and unwelcoming. The walls themselves seemed to hum with a quiet magic, a force that reminded any visitor that this was not a place to linger. It was a kingdom of beauty and danger, where one's own reflection could be more fearsome than any monster, and where silence weighed heavier than the thickest stone. The Snow Queen herself was not merely a queen in the way that humans understood rulers. She was a presence, a force entwined with the frost and ice that shaped her world. She moved like a shadow across the snowfields, her hair and robes shimmering with the cold light of the north, and her gaze as piercing as the shards that had scattered across the earth. Her power was absolute and quiet. It did not need proclamation, for the very world obeyed her. The snow fell wherever she lingered. The wind whispered her name even when no one spoke it. And the cold seemed to gather around her, as if drawn to her very being. She was not cruel for the sake of cruelty, nor beautiful for vanity alone. But her beauty and power were such that they could command fear, awe, and a kind of helpless fascination all at once. Kai, the boy whose heart had begun to harden under the influence of the demon's shard, felt her presence before he could see it. It was a cold that rose from the earth itself, brushing against his skin and threading through his thoughts, making his mind sharper, his feelings sharper, yet quieter, smaller. The warmth of his home, the gentle touch of his friends, the comfort of familiar voices, these began to fade like echoes through fog. He walked through streets and forests, yet his steps seemed guided by an invisible hand, drawing him northward toward the heart of frost and silence. It was not force that took him, nor fear, but a strange, irresistible pull, like a river flowing beneath ice, silent yet unstoppable. He did not resist, for part of him no longer remembered why he would, and the shard inside him whispered that the cold was truth, and that the world of warmth and laughter was fragile, fleeting, and unworthy. Each step drew him closer to the ice palaces, closer to the vast, mirrored halls of the Snow Queen. And yet the journey was not marked by sound or fanfare. It was quiet, and the quiet itself was a warning. The wind whispered through the frozen trees, carrying hints of shapes too bright and sharp to be safe. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the snow, stretching into corridors of crystal that led only deeper into her domain. Meanwhile, in the small town far to the south, Gerda sensed that something had changed. She did not know the cause, nor did she understand the nature of the darkness moving toward Kai. But she felt his absence as sharply as if it were a wound in her own chest. Gerda was no ordinary friend. She was a figure of persistence and quiet courage, a girl whose heart, unshaken by frost or fear, had always noticed what others overlooked. She knew that Kai would not have wandered so far without reason, and that whatever had taken him was not something that could be ignored. In the stillness of her room, she made a decision. She would follow him, no matter where the path led, no matter how cold or perilous the journey might be. Her preparation was minimal, for she carried with her only the essentials, and her determination was heavier than any cloak or bundle. She stepped into the cold, feeling the wind bite at her cheeks and the snow cling to her hair and clothing. The landscape ahead was vast and unyielding, forests where every tree was a frozen sentinel. Rivers she would have to cross without the comfort of warmth, and open fields where the snow shimmered with a brightness that could blind, and always, just beyond the horizon, the sense of a power watching, waiting, and drawing nearer. As Gerda moved forward, the motifs of the journey began to reveal themselves. Each step was a test, each snow-laden hill a reminder that the world she entered was not as forgiving as her home. Yet her heart burned with a warmth that resisted the cold, a tiny flame in a land where fire could not exist. It was this warmth that allowed her to notice subtle signs, tracks in the snow that hinted at movement, glimpses of figures reflected in the icy surfaces that did not belong to the present, and the quiet pulse of the world itself, as if the land were breathing in anticipation. Kai's movement, guided by the shard and by the subtle influence of the Snow Queen, led him ever closer to her palace. Yet even as he approached, fragments of memory flickered within him. Images of Gerda, of laughter, of warmth and sunlight. These glimpses were fleeting, as fragile as frost, melting under a brief sunbeam, but they hinted at the possibility of resistance. The Snow Queen's power was immense, but it was not absolute. Even the strongest frost could be challenged by persistence, by heart, by memory. The kingdom around him deepened into silence and grandeur. Mountains of ice rose like sleeping giants, their faces sharp and glistening in the dim northern light. Snowfields stretched beyond vision, and the very air seemed to hum with enchantment, warning any who entered that they had stepped into a realm shaped not by ordinary hands, but by the will of a force beyond human comprehension. Every step Kai took was mirrored in the frozen rivers. Every breath reflected in the glittering frost, and every thought shadowed by the presence of the Queen herself. For Gerda, the journey was just beginning, yet already she felt the magnitude of the path ahead. The cold was not merely temperature, but challenge, a test of heart, determination, and love. Her footsteps carried her further into the unknown, each one a small defiance of the frost that would seek to claim her, just as it had begun to claim Kai. And in the distance, beyond hills and ice, the palace waited, gleaming and silent, filled with mirrors and frost, waiting to draw him entirely into its grip. The Snow Queen's world was vast, her influence inescapable, yet the story had only begun. The threads of warmth and courage were stretching across the frozen landscape, connecting a girl and a boy, two hearts that had been threatened by ice and shadow. The kingdom of snow, with its haunting beauty and its quiet, absolute power, was not yet fully revealed, and the journey that would take Gerda closer to Kai's heart and to the heart of the Snow Queen's domain had only just begun. The winds of the north blew steadily, carrying whispers across valleys and forests. The silence of the palace, the glint of ice, the pull of the shard within Kai, they all hinted at a larger world of frost and enchantment. And as Gerda moved forward, step by determined step, the cold and the distance between her and Kai were challenges she had yet to understand, forces she would need to face, and trials that would shape the journey far beyond the reach of warmth she had always known. Gerda's journey led her far from the familiar warmth of her home, into lands shaped as much by emotion as by frost. The forests she entered were dark and tangled, the branches twisting like fingers reaching from shadow into shadow. The snow lay thick upon the ground, masking the paths she might have followed, and forcing her to trust in her own senses and determination. Every footstep seemed to echo in the stillness, yet no echo returned. The silence pressed against her chest, reminding her that the warmth of home was distant, that the cold of the world could reach even the smallest hearts, and that the Snow Queen's influence stretched beyond the ice and snow to touch those she loved. The first trials were subtle but unrelenting. Wild animals crossed her path, their eyes glinting with hunger and caution. A fox darted between trees, its tail brushing the snow in warning. A flock of crows circled overhead, their cries sharp and accusing, as if questioning her courage. She met these creatures not with weapons, but with stillness and observation, learning their rhythms, their needs, and their fears. Each encounter, though brief, became a lesson. The world was harsh, but it was not cruel beyond reason. There were patterns, there was patience, and there was a quiet way to endure that required more than strength. It required understanding. Fields stretched endlessly after the forests, barren and white, the snow packed firm beneath her feet. Here, the sun reflected off the ice in blinding brilliance, so much that she had to close her eyes at times to shield them from the cold clarity. The fields were silent except for the wind, which carried the faintest whispers of those lost or changed by the shards scattered across the world. Gerda felt these echoes as small pangs in her chest, realizing that the shard's reach was vast. She remembered Kai, the subtle change in his eyes, the quiet distance that had grown in his heart, and she understood in a new way that the shards could twist perception, harden hearts, and make warmth seem foolish or weak. Crossing a frozen river was the next challenge, a stretch of ice that reflected the grey sky and seemed to go on forever. Each step was careful, deliberate, and terrifying in its potential consequences. The river's surface shifted beneath her, groaning like a creature aware of its own fragility. The cold wind cut at her face, and the glint of ice reminded her of the shard's origin. How something small and sharp could change everything it touched. As she walked, she thought of those who had fallen to the shards, how the warmth of families, of friendships, of trust could be undermined by a single piece of fractured magic. Her reflection on the ice was fragmented, a reminder of the very mirrors that had shattered the world, showing her distorted images of herself as well as Kai. Along the way, strangers appeared, their presence both helpful and perplexing. A traveler once shared a blanket and bread, yet his eyes held suspicion, a hint of indifference that seemed almost unnatural. Gerda sensed the subtle cold in his heart, as though a shard had brushed against him, and she felt both pity and determination. Another time, a merchant offered guidance, but his words were misleading, testing her discernment and her trust. These encounters were trials not of strength, but of character, showing that the journey required her to navigate not only the snow and ice, but also the hearts and intentions of those she met. The world, she realized, was as full of hidden dangers as it was of open ones, and every step demanded patience, insight, and courage. Sometimes, when she paused to rest, Gerda reflected on the power of the shards and the subtlety of their influence. It was not brute force that made them dangerous, nor was it magic alone. The shards were fragments of perception, turning simple kindness into suspicion, playful laughter into cruelty, and the bright light of memory into cold, distant images. She thought of Kai, how the warmth of his heart had dimmed, and how quickly love could be overshadowed by something so small and sharp. It was a dark thought, yet one that strengthened her resolve. She understood that her journey was not simply to find him, but to confront the frost that had taken hold of him, and perhaps of many others, and to bring warmth back into a world that had begun to see only sharp edges. The landscapes themselves mirrored her inner struggles. Forests were tangled whence her doubts grew. Barren fields stretched endlessly, when she felt the weight of exhaustion, and the frozen rivers reflected both her determination and her fears. The cold became a teacher, revealing the limits of the body and mind, but also offering a clarity that heat and comfort could not provide. She learned to recognize subtle shifts in the wind, to listen to the silence, and to trust in the small flame of persistence that burned within her heart. Each step forward was an act of defiance against the cold that sought to claim her, just as it had claimed Kai. Time in this frozen world became both fluid and rigid. Days and nights blurred under the endless sky, the pale sun rising and falling with slow inevitability. Stars appeared in the evenings, bright and cold, guiding her path with a distant brilliance. The wind seemed to carry messages, whispers of encouragement and warning woven together, reminding her that the Snow Queen's domain was near, that the palace of ice and mirrors awaited, and that the final challenges would be unlike anything she had faced. The shard inside Kai, and perhaps others hidden across the lands, pulsed with unseen power, drawing the two hearts toward a confrontation that Gerda had not yet fully imagined, but that she knew would demand every ounce of courage she could summon. At times, she encountered signs of the Snow Queen herself, subtle shapes reflected in the ice, fleeting shadows that moved with impossible precision, a cold breeze that seemed alive with intention. These were warnings, not threats, reminders that she was approaching the edges of the realm where the ordinary laws of warmth and care did not apply. The closer she came, the sharper the world became, as if the air itself was imbued with her presence. The ice seemed to grow taller, the snow deeper, and the silence heavier. Every step was a step away from safety, from the comfort of the world she knew, and toward the unknown expanse of frost and enchantment that could claim hearts and minds alike. Yet despite the challenges, Gerda pressed forward. She drew strength not from power, but from the small, steady truths that had always guided her. The memory of Kai's laughter, the love of her home, and the quiet flame of persistence that refused to be extinguished. Her journey through forests, fields, and frozen rivers was more than a physical struggle. It was a trial of heart, a test of resolve, and an exploration of the fragile warmth that could survive even in the coldest places. With each mile, she learned more about herself, about the world, and about the strange, subtle forces that could twist human hearts and the courage required to restore them. The distance grew, and with it, the anticipation. The forest thinned into wide, open snowscapes. The rivers and fields led to mountains carved with jagged ice and cliffs that glimmered like broken glass. Every reflection, every shadow, every whisper of the wind seemed to hint at the palace ahead, at the vast halls of mirrors and frost, where Kai had already begun to feel the Snow Queen's pull. The path was still uncertain, fraught with danger, yet the trail was undeniable. Every step Gerda took brought her closer to the confrontation that awaited, to the heart of the kingdom she had not yet fully seen, and to the boy whose warmth she hoped to restore. And so she walked on, through the darkness and the cold, through forests that tested patience, fields that tested endurance, and rivers that tested balance. Every trial strengthened her resolve, every challenge clarified her purpose, and every reflection reminded her of the stakes she faced. The Snow Queen's kingdom was near, her power palpable in the shifting air, and the end of this portion of the journey was not a conclusion, but a threshold. Beyond the next rise of ice, beyond the next bend in the frozen rivers, lay the realm itself, a place of beauty, peril, and the ultimate test of warmth against frost. The trials had begun, and Gerda's journey, both external and internal, was far from over. The winds of the north carried whispers of the palace. The ice mirrored her determination, and the Snow Queen's influence stretched outward, touching everything in its silent, patient way. And as the path led her further from safety, toward the place where hearts could be frozen or freed, the story continued, unfolding across snow and ice, through courage and resilience, toward the realm where the Snow Queen awaited. The palace rose before Gerda like a mountain carved entirely from the purest ice, its spires sharp against the pale northern sky, each one catching the light and scattering it in dazzling shards that danced across the frozen landscape. From a distance, it seemed almost unreal, a glittering vision that could belong only to dreams or legends. Yet as she approached, the scale of it became terrifying. Towers stretched endlessly upward, windows of ice reflecting the world in fragmented patterns, and walls so smooth that even the touch of a hand seemed unable to disturb them. The air was heavy, almost still, carrying the faintest hum of magic, a quiet pulse that resonated with the frost beneath her feet. The silence was not peace. It was the presence of power, vast and unyielding, reminding every step that she was far from warmth and ordinary life. Mirrors were everywhere in the palace, not just in halls or chambers, but scattered along staircases, embedded in floors, and glinting like shards in unexpected corners. Some reflected her own image perfectly, and others distorted it, lengthening her limbs, shrinking her form, twisting her face in ways that were almost imperceptible. She realized with a quiet shiver that the palace itself was alive with enchantment, a trap woven of ice and reflection, designed to confuse, to slow, and perhaps even to trap those who dared enter. Yet Gerda did not falter. Each mirror she passed, each hall she entered, was met with steady footsteps, a heart that burned with warmth, and the memory of Kai's laughter guiding her forward. Inside, the corridors twisted like frozen rivers, branching endlessly, sometimes leading to chambers filled with glittering ice statues that seemed almost human, frozen mid-motion in gestures of dance, despair, or devotion. Some reflected moments of memory, images of people she had known, now caught in frozen tableaux that made her heart ache. The palace was more than architecture. It was a world of enchantment, designed to test, to confound, and to show the mind the beauty and cruelty of the frost. Every step she took was deliberate, every choice of direction a measure of courage and insight. Kai's presence was felt long before she saw him. He moved through the palace as if drawn by its power, the shard lodged in his heart giving him a strange clarity, yet clouding the warmth of memory and friendship. He walked corridors lined with mirrors that reflected only the coldest versions of himself. And in those reflections, he could see how far he had been drawn from the boy he had once been. The pull of the Snow Queen was immense, a quiet, persistent force that whispered of clarity, perfection, and understanding. Through frost and distance, the allure of ice, of a world untouched by weakness, pressed against his mind, and yet fragments of memory, a flicker of Gerda's smile, the warmth of her hand, the laughter they had shared. rose within him, fragile but persistent, hinting at a force stronger than the frost. Gerda moved closer, each step carrying a warmth that was almost tangible in the frozen halls. She reached chambers filled with icicles that hung like swords, and floors that reflected not only her own feet, but the paths she had walked in thought, in memory, and in courage. Sometimes she paused to breathe, noticing the subtle effects of the palace on her own mind, reflections that tempted despair, whispers that suggested futility, and the strange, cold brilliance of the mirrors that made her own heart ache for the warmth she carried. And yet, she pressed onward, feeling the heat of determination radiate through her. Each step weakening the silent grip the palace seemed to have over all who entered. Kai felt her presence as well, though the shard clouded his understanding. A warmth, distant yet familiar, moved through the halls like a stubborn sunbeam, breaking through endless snow. It stirred something deep within him, a small but unyielding resistance to the cold that had begun to dominate his heart. The images in the mirrors wavered, the clarity of the ice softened in subtle ways, and the pull of the Snow Queen, though immense, faltered ever so slightly in the face of a warmth that was relentless in its persistence. Kai's mind became a battlefield, one side drawn to the absolute perfection and silence of frost, the other tethered to memory, friendship, and a warmth that refused to be extinguished. The palace tested Gerda in ways both physical and subtle. Staircases rose impossibly, twisting toward ceilings that reflected the northern sky, and floors dropped into mirrored depths that suggested endless falls. Ice bridges stretched across voids, fragile and shimmering, and the echo of every footstep was magnified, carrying both warning and challenge. She encountered rooms where the walls reflected only fragments of herself, pieces she barely recognized. Yet even here, she walked with steady resolve, guided by the thought of Kai and the warmth that had never left her heart. Every chamber revealed more of the Snow Queen's magic. Ice statues moved slightly when not observed, shadows of their frozen limbs stretching as if alive. The mirrors reflected her, Kai, and the palace itself in endless patterns, creating the sense that the world within was vast, infinite, and subtly hostile. And yet, through the twisting halls and glittering corridors, Gerda moved with purpose, each step weakening the enchantments, just enough for her to see faint glimpses of Kai, distant and uncertain, moving through the same halls under the pull of the shard and the cold influence of the Queen. Kai's internal struggle deepened. He knew the comfort and warmth of memory, yet the absolute clarity of the Snow Queen's world was seductive. The ice whispered promises of understanding and safety, of a world without the imperfections and unpredictability that warmth brought. Yet every glimpse of Gerda, every faint memory of laughter or kindness, brought hesitation, a ripple in the ice that had held his mind captive. He felt the tension of two forces, one cold, absolute, and majestic, the other fragile, persistent, and human. His own heart, though shadowed by frost, still remembered warmth, still felt the tug of friendship, still longed for connection. Gerda's determination acted like sunlight against the frost. She moved with quiet courage, allowing no hesitation to root her in fear. The warmth of her heart radiated, touching the edges of the palace, seeping into cracks of ice and reflection. Mirrors shifted, statues seemed less rigid, and faint echoes of laughter and life began to permeate the halls. She did not confront the Snow Queen directly, for the Queen's power was absolute within the palace. Yet every step Gerda took weakened the subtle hold the Queen had on Kai, showing that persistence and love could pierce even the most silent and perfect frost. The palace seemed endless, yet each corridor, staircase, and chamber was a step closer to the heart of the Snow Queen's influence, and to Kai, the air itself seemed to hum with the tension of approaching confrontation. The magic of ice balanced against the warmth of human resolve. Gerda did not know what would happen next, nor how the struggle within Kai would resolve. But she knew that she could not stop, that the path through this kingdom of mirrors and frost was hers to follow, and that her own warmth was the only guide capable of navigating the Snow Queen's enchantments. And so, step by deliberate step, she moved through the glittering, mirrored halls, deeper into the vastness of the palace. Kai's struggle continued silently, the shard in his heart pulling him toward perfection and frost, Gerda's warmth calling him back toward memory and humanity. The Snow Queen's presence lingered like a shadow over all, powerful, still, and patient. Yet the faintest crack of uncertainty had appeared in the perfection of her icy domain. The palace was magnificent and menacing, yet not invincible. The story of frost and warmth, of ice and heart, of Kai and Gerda, was nearing the threshold of revelation, but it was not yet complete. The final steps, the deepest chambers, and the ultimate challenge remained ahead, waiting in silence as the narrative continued, unfolding within the heart of the Snow Queen's frozen kingdom. The final halls of the Snow Queen's palace stretched endlessly before Gerda, their walls of ice reflecting her determined figure in countless fragments. Mirrors that had once distorted and confused now began to tremble in the presence of warmth, subtle and unrelenting. Every step she took carried more than weight. It carried persistence, memory, and a pulse of human emotion that the palace, with all its frost and magic, could not fully absorb. She felt, before she saw him, the pull of Kai's presence ahead. A presence not entirely lost, yet caught in a web of ice and distant thought. Kai stood before a great mirror in the palace's central hall, the largest of all. The shard lodged deep in his heart, and eye had long since cast him into a state between memory and frost. His gaze was distant, sharp, and cold, reflecting the perfection of the Snow Queen's enchantments. Yet there was a flicker within him, small and fragile, like a candle struggling against a wind. That flicker was Gerda, the warmth of her heart, her relentless pursuit, the memories of friendship, laughter, and shared days, all reaching across the frozen expanse that had claimed him. Gerda stepped forward, her voice unspoken, but resonating in every motion, in every heartbeat. The ice beneath her seemed to shiver at her presence. She did not demand, nor plead. She simply moved closer, and the warmth she carried touched the edges of Kai's frozen heart. The palace, magnificent and impervious in its crystalline grandeur, responded subtly. At first, mirrors rattled, reflecting his image with slight distortions. The rigid lines of frost in the hall softened, and the air, once sharp as knives, carried a faint hint of something warmer, something familiar and human. Kai felt it before he understood it. The warmth brushing his mind did not attack or force, but reminded him of something he had not realized he had missed: the feeling of being seen, of being loved without condition. Memories rose like small lights behind the shards that had clouded his perception. Gerda's laugh, the quiet comfort of home, the ordinary kindness of friends, and the small, ordinary joys that had once filled his days. The shards quivered in response, as if sensing their grip weakening, and the cold that had seemed eternal began to soften, just slightly, around the edges of his heart. The Snow Queen's presence, while vast and silent, did not vanish. Her gaze, ever watchful, recognized the shift. The ice around Kai's heart was not melting from force, but from persistence, from the purity of a warmth that refused to yield. Each heartbeat, each memory stirred by Gerda's presence, loosened the shards, unseating them from their lodged positions. It was a gradual process, almost imperceptible, yet unstoppable. The frost that had seemed eternal began to fracture, not with violence, but with subtle and quiet dissolution, as if acknowledging that the coldest heart could still respond to the smallest flicker of love. Kai's struggle was internal and profound. Every fiber of him had been shaped by the shard, by the Queen's influence, and by the perfection of frost. Yet the persistence of Gerda's warmth acted as a counterforce, a gentle but unrelenting pressure that reminded him of what it meant to feel, to care, to remember. His eyes, once sharp and distant, softened. The rigid patterns in his thoughts loosened, allowing the brightness of memory and the simplicity of affection to seep back in. He felt the shard begin to dislodge, a small but powerful motion that reverberated through his heart. Each fragment that fell away carried with it a portion of the frost that had dulled his perception, and as it fell, the air in the hall seemed to brighten, the mirrors no longer so cruelly sharp, the ice not so perfectly rigid. Gerda reached him finally, her hands brushing the shards that clung to the edges of his perception. The gesture was quiet, without force, yet it carried the full weight of human persistence and love. In that touch, Kai's heart began to thaw fully, the frost dissolving into warmth that spread through his chest, like a spring sun breaking through winter clouds. The shards fell harmlessly to the floor, powerless against the force of enduring care and courage. In the center of the palace, amidst spires of ice and walls lined with mirrors, the quiet miracle of thawing occurred, subtle yet absolute, reshaping the hall in the glow of restored humanity. The Snow Queen, observing, did not rage nor intervene. Her presence remained magnificent and chilling, yet even she recognized that the frost she commanded could not claim a heart fully committed to warmth and courage. The palace, though still grand and glimmering, no longer held the oppressive weight it had before. Mirrors reflected more than cold perfection. They now captured fragments of memory, light, and life. The statues that had seemed frozen in despair showed hints of motion, as if the persistence of heart had touched even the very stone and crystal of the halls. Kai and Gerda stepped together through the palace, their steps lighter now, each one carrying both relief and understanding. The ice beneath their feet melted into small streams of water, trickling toward the edges of the frozen halls, carrying with it the subtle knowledge that warmth could exist even in the most absolute cold. The air itself seemed to shift, carrying the faint scent of thawed earth and sunlight, the first hints of return to the ordinary world beyond the palace. The shards, once sharp and hidden, lay powerless, reminders of danger overcome, and of the subtle fragility of hearts in the face of enchantment. Their journey back through the palace was quiet, but deliberate. The halls that had once seemed endless and threatening now reflected their steps with a gentle clarity. Every mirror, every surface carried fragments of thawed frost, a testament to the persistence of care, courage, and the enduring human spirit. Kai's mind was clear once more, yet he carried with him the lessons of frost, the knowledge of fragility, the understanding of the sharpness that could enter hearts unseen, and a recognition of how easily perception could be distorted. And Gerda, steadfast as ever, knew that warmth, persistence, and love were forces as powerful as the coldest magic, capable of restoring what had been lost. When they stepped beyond the palace doors, the world beyond seemed to shimmer with possibility. The landscape, though still winter-bound, carried the faint hints of spring. Snow softened, rivers ran freely, and sunlight touched the land with gentle clarity. Kai breathed deeply, feeling the warmth of his own heart, the enduring pull of friendship, and the profound relief of human connection. Restored, Gerda walked beside him, her determination undiminished, aware that their journey had reshaped them both. They had faced enchantments, frost, and the subtle corruption of shards, yet they had returned stronger, their hearts resilient and enduring. The Snow Queen's realm remained magnificent and cold, yet no longer absolute. Its beauty was undeniable, but so, too, was the understanding that warmth and courage could pierce even the deepest frost. Kai and Gerda returned to their own world, changed but whole, carrying with them the knowledge that hearts, though fragile, could endure, and that love and persistence could confront even the darkest and most absolute enchantments. In the days that followed, the ordinary world seemed brighter, not because it had changed, but because they had. Rivers that had once seemed ordinary glimmered with a new clarity. Laughter felt deeper, and the warmth of home and friendship was no longer taken for granted. The shards, though scattered elsewhere, were powerless in their hearts, reminders of danger and of the resilience required to preserve connection and trust. Courage, love, and the persistence of heart had triumphed, not with force, but with subtle, enduring power. And so, the tale of frost, mirrors, and the Snow Queen reached its close. Kay and Gerda, guided by memory, persistence, and the warmth of human care, returned from the kingdom of ice to the ordinary world, forever shaped by what they had seen and felt. The Snow Queen remained, distant and magnificent, her palace a monument to beauty and power, yet no longer a force able to claim hearts untouched by love. The story concluded, yet it existed within a larger world of wonder, danger, and the eternal tension between cold and warmth, between fear and courage, between frost and the resilient human spirit. In the end, hearts endure, warmth persists, and love, quiet, determined, and unyielding, remains the strongest force of all.